All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, I am excited to have two new guests, one of which I was trying to get on the podcast for a long, long, long time. So, without any ado, here is Roman and David. Hey, guys.
What's going on? Thanks for having us, Jerry.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey,
I'm very, very, very nervously excited to have you guys. Anyway, how's it going?
It's going well. It's good to see this guy behind the microphone here. We're
yeah,
gonna
good to
get,
see you
get
guys.
a knowledge dump. Is that what we're gonna look for? Is some sort of knowledge dump from you today, Roman?
From me?
That's right. That's exactly right.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
How many podcasts have you done before?
0.
Fantastic. This is like we're breaking ground here. This is earth shattering.
Yeah.
Wow, you're pretty smooth at talking. Not bad.
David, you talk for a living, don't you?
I do talk for communicate for sure. More
Right.
more on the writing side, but yeah, for sure, communication is
Yeah.
is where I'm at, where the bulk of my work is for sure.
Yeah. So I had this idea for Roman, especially, to have his own time on the podcast to just share things from his life, from his experience, from his knowledge, more so. Um, and I don't know if you were more shy or not, but
I'm very shy. I'm a very shy person.
Well, first, why don't you because there's gonna be people listening to this. Why don't you let everybody know where you're from and a little bit about your background?
I'm originally from Belarus, capital city Minsk. When I was born, it was still part of the Soviet Union. So I was born and grew up in Soviet Union, basically. Soviet Union collapsed when I was about 11 or 12. And then couple years later, when I was 14, our family moved to United States. Moved around a bit, but most of my life I lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And more recently, during COVID, I moved my family to Poland, and we spent almost 2 years in Poland doing missionary work. Then came back here to Charlotte 3 years ago.
nice. So now you're in Charlotte. You're having
Yeah.
lots of fun in Charlotte, right? What do you do these
Debatable.
days?
I work as a project management for a company here in Charlotte. Just started recently. Go to church with my family. Yeah, just trying to get back to normal life after the COVID and whatever happened during that period.
What is your passion?
I feel like I'm being targeted here.
You might be. It's possible you're being
So
targeted.
maybe
but
before answering that question, so David, how about you? Well, my audience may not know who you are. So a little background on you, like where were you born? Where did you how did you end up in Charlotte?
I can guarantee your audience doesn't know who I am. So it's not that they might not know who I am; they for sure don't know who I am. But my name is David Perrera. I was born and raised in New Jersey. My background is my mom on my mom's side, half Russian, half Ukrainian. My dad's side was Italian, and pretty much in New Jersey, if you go to a church in New Jersey, there's probably about a 95% chance that you're going to a Catholic church, particularly Roman Catholic Church. That's the sort of the official church of New Jersey. But I was raised marginally Catholic. When I say marginally, we were Creasters. Christmas and Easter were the only times that we went to church, and from there, I growing up, I had really no understanding of what the Christian faith was, or have any background in Christian faith, and sort of went in the direction I guess I would be described possibly in that time frame of my life, meaning like high school, marginally atheistic, possibly even agnostic to a degree. And then went off to college and lived life certainly not as a Christian believer. And then fast forward to 2009 when I met my now wife, my fiance, and we came to a point in our relationship where we were either going to go in two completely different directions or something radical had to happen. And again, my then fiance said to me, I don't know if this means anything, but when I grew up, my grandma took me to something called an Assemblies of God church. And I don't know if God can fix this. I don't even know if I believe in God, but maybe we should go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And we happened to go to a church in New Jersey, Lakewood, New Jersey. And that day the preacher was preaching on forgiveness. And it was hit right to the heart of exactly everything that we were going through at the time. And, there's more to the story, but basically from that point on, 2009 is when I became a believer in Christ, a full on live my life, for Christ believer.
Mm-hmm.
And to if I were to ask myself the same question I asked Roman, it's, I have a passion for particularly, evangelism and apologetics,
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of where for the viewers that may have heard of me, you might know that already, but I can almost guarantee they haven't.
Yeah. And then how did you end up in Charlotte?
Sorry, you asked that. I apologize. Long way of getting there. But so in New Jersey, I married my wife, and then we had a call from the Lord to move to Florida. We moved down to a town called Lakeland, Florida, and then we were there for about 4 years. Moved to another town in Florida, and then had a call to move here to Charlotte. But interestingly enough, somewhere in the mix there, when I went to college, I actually went to college at UNC Charlotte. So I have some background here, and graduated in 2001 to date myself. But we had some friends, a bunch of friends in ministry that moved here to Charlotte. We sort of followed them out here, and that's how we came back to Charlotte.
So I hear a lot of Christians say, I'm called to do this, or God told me to do this or that. How do you determine that it was God who told you, and how did God tell you?
Such a great question. So just to kind of talk, I want to talk specifically to the time when we moved from one town in Florida to the next, because this is sort of the clearest example of that. I had a dream one night where we were in this town, Lakeland, and I wasn't really finding work. We picked up and moved. I didn't have a job, and I one night had a dream. And in this dream, I saw this house, and this house was the only way I could describe it. When I woke up and I told my wife, I said, I had this strange dream that we were living in this house, and it looked like a bank. Mm-hmm. The front was all brick, and there were these pillars in front of it. I had, not having any work at that time, I had no business of dreaming that we lived in a house that looked like this. Fast forward to about a year later, my wife got this notification on her phone, like a Zillow notification, and this. It was a town that was 2 hours away from where we were living, and this notification came up that there was this house that was available. Again, I didn't have really steady pay at that time, so it wasn't like I could just go and get a mortgage on a house. So she showed me this notification. She said, and didn't say anything, and it was a year and a half in advance, and I said, "What are you showing me?" She said, "Was that not the house in your dream?" And it literally was the exact house that I remembered when I woke up and told her that this was the house. So that same day, and the lease on the house we were living in was coming due. We got in the car. We drove to this house to see it. The gentleman was selling the house, but he happened to be a pastor, and also said that, look, if you can't get a mortgage right now, I'd be happy to rent the house to you as well. Mm-hmm. And within, probably a matter of a week, we had signed the lease and we were moving out to this house. So that, Jerry, if I were to tell you like the pieces of what I would consider confirmation, meaning that I've heard from outside sources leading up to the point where we got in the car and packed our stuff and moved to that house, you would be blown away by the amount of like God clearly intervening and his divine providence in the process. And we see exactly him doing things that got us to move to this house that we had no idea that we were going to be living in. Again, God giving me that dream about a year and a half prior to. Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like these improbable coincidences that lined up in such a way that statistically they would not be possible.
Very well said. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't use the word impossible, but improbable is the right word for that, for sure. Yeah, that would be very, very unlikely for all of these things to sort of fall into place the way they did, unless there was some sort of, influence, some outside influence. Some might consider that to be coincidence. I consider it to be God.
Nice. Roman, tell us a story.
About what?
Anything.
Yeah, you get to the mic, my friend.
You have to give me some guidance. What
So
kind of
tell
story
us a
you're
little
looking
bit
for?
about what we were talking about earlier, Plato's cave. What is that all about?
Well, it's a story or illustration that Plato came up with. Well, I don't know. It's at least it's accredited to him, right? That he did came up with that to describe reality. That reality consists of this physical world that we can touch and assess with our senses empirically, and then the world of forms, something that cannot be really assessed with physical methods or sense experience. Yeah. So you want to know what the analogy is, or the story is?
Yeah. So like there's some people in the cave, right? And they see shadows on the wall. So like kind of elaborate on
Yeah,
that.
I actually first time I heard the story when I was a kid. I don't remember the context where I heard it, but I always thought like, oh wow, that's the way Christianity is. So the story goes that there are a bunch of prisoners who are in a cave, and their hands are chained, their heads are fixed in one position, and all they can do is look at the wall. And this is for the entire lifetime that they live. They have this experience. All they see is shadows on the wall. So behind them there is great light that shines on the wall, and between the light and the wall, different things happen. People walk, animals walk, people play with a ball maybe or something like this. And all the prisoners can do is just observe these shadows on the wall. And for them, that's the only real thing. That's all they see. And then one of the prisoners gets released, and he turns around, he starts walking backwards, and he realizes that, hey, wow, there's so much more depth to everything that we've been experiencing. We've just been seeing shadow, but there's like so much more behind these shadows. Then eventually this prisoner gets caught and put back into this place with other prisoners, and now he's trying to explain to other prisoners his experience, like, hey guys, I've experienced so much more. And nobody's really believing him. They think he's just this crazy person who lost his mind. And when, as a kid, I heard this story, I'm like, man, this is the way we Christians are. Because growing up in Soviet Union, in schools, atheists, teachers, and other leadership authority figures always were making fun of Christians. And I thought, like, well, I feel like that one prisoner who was released and experienced, God, a bigger, richer reality. And now I go back to this school full of atheists, and I'm telling them about God, and they're laughing at me, thinking that I'm crazy. So that's when I discovered it as a kid. And then later on, when I was an adult, I read that it was part of Plato's philosophy, bigger philosophy about metaphysics and epistemology, and study of knowledge and study of reality. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a nice story. What are some things that you're doing today outside of work? What are you studying? What are you learning?
Really like to learn. Actually, the new job I started, there's a lot of engineering involved. I never ever thought that I would be interested in learning anything about engineering. But now I find myself spending hours on YouTube watching different engineering videos about how electricity was discovered, how it works, different chemistry and chemical and biological components, and how they react, and mechanical things. All this stuff is fascinating, especially when you can practically apply it to what you do for a job. So this is very recent. This is just in the last 4 or 5 weeks that's been happening. But other than that, I really enjoy reading theology and philosophy. Those are probably two of my favorite subjects. I really enjoy psychology. I'm not too knowledgeable in psychology, but I definitely enjoy different studies that have been done, especially groundbreaking studies. I really enjoy industrial or organizational psychology. I really enjoy personality psychology, things like that. But most of the stuff I read, and I read typically anywhere between 30 to 50 books a year. I set that goal for myself, just to stay on track. Most of the books I would read would be on theology primarily, and then a little bit on philosophy. And last year I took a fast from theological and philosophical books. I read only like business books and a little bit of organizational psychology and some construction and stuff like that.
Can I ask a question, Jerry? Is that all
Sure.
right? So you told us a story earlier about your coworker, and I thought it was a fascinating story. I was wondering if you could tell that story again, because I enjoyed that story.
I think I will not share that story because I feel that conversation was very intimate, and
That's fair enough.
and I don't know how that person would feel if he would go on social media and see
That's fair.
that being discussed. And I know that the probability of that happening is very slim, but
Doesn't matter. Yeah, no, I
yeah.
think it's a good.
but
point.
I feel comfortable sharing it when it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
two,
no,
three of us. But on the screen, that's different.
No, that's fine. I got a question actually for both of you. Either one of you can answer first, and then the next person. When it comes to ideas, is there such a thing as an original idea? An idea that didn't original, like an idea that never came or did not come from something else before, like completely original, like not based on anything else from before.
Do you want to go first?
I'm still assessing the question.
Okay. I mean the way so I like to define things, before I, commit to an answer typically. So so if we were to, when you say completely original, I mean, in other words, in the way that the idea presents itself, there might be one single characteristic of that idea that could be different or throw off from being, ever thought of before. Are we talking?
Well, let me give a negative example
Okay.
of an idea that is not original.
Okay.
So you have birds flying and flapping their wings, or at least the shape of the wing and so on. And people came up with airplanes or flying kites or whatever it is based on birds, basically the way birds fly. So the flight, the artificial flight, is not an original idea because it came from something else. So to me, an original idea would be like somebody thought of something completely unique, not influenced by any kind of surrounding or anything, and then was like, okay, this would be a great thing to create or invent or whatever it is.
I remember when I was in a youth group, this is like 20 plus years ago, a youth leader said something like this, like he said, you cannot invent a new color. God already created all the colors that there are. You cannot create a new color, invent or create. Like all you can do is combine things that already exist. Like, and that triggered this thinking that, like, well, really everything there is there. Like God created it. We are unable to add to it. All we can do is be creative by combining different concepts together, right, and come up with a new combination of things. But really, we cannot create something. So this is the thoughts that came to my mind when I thought about your question. That really, all we can do is combine the already existing things. We cannot invent something. We can discover something. We can be creative by combining existing concepts. But can we create something absolutely new that hasn't existed before? Probably not, unless we call a combination of things.
Well, there's a difference between creation and idea, right? I mean, that's the question: is an idea correct, or
Right.
you started talking about a concrete?
Right. I mean, idea, invention. I mean, ideas lead to something tangible, or maybe it's not completely tangible, but some product or thing or concept or whatever it is.
So I'm going to give an example. I'm going to maybe throw the question back to you, right? So I have a side business where I have mealworms for chickens, right? And they go through a process called lyophilization, and it's a fancy word for freeze drying. So what happens is you take anything, but in this example a worm, and you freeze it to a point where it's frozen, and then you put it in a machine, and that machine pulls the moisture out of it, so that it doesn't lose any of like its original, I guess, characteristics to a certain degree. Somebody had to create the process of lyophilization first, or had to be the first person to create that, right? That particular process. So would that be an example of an original idea?
It depends. So if somebody like spontaneously said, what if we pull all the moisture out of this and therefore preserve this thing? Then yes. But if they saw something dry up in the sun and they're like, oh, look at that raisin, it kind of dried out in the sun. What if we figured out a way to dry things out and preserve things that way? Then it's not an original idea.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
It seems a little bit like a loaded question, like you've maybe asked this question before, possibly, and you have some wisdom for us that you might want to share here.
I mean, maybe it's loaded in the sense that my belief is that there is no such thing.
Gotcha.
I think, or I believe that every idea comes from something else, and people who are exposed to more concepts, more things, more experiences, I think those people are the ones who have the ability, or at least the opportunity, to come up with more ideas. I think, like David, you mentioned that you have ideas just kind of flowing out of you, right? Like, and other people may not. So I don't know if it's because of the amount of knowledge or data that you have, or if it's some kind of a processing capability of your mind to generate ideas based on that. But regardless, I think it does. Like, the ideas come from something else. It's like, okay, well, I saw this, and what if I do something with these two objects? Now I can create some third, fourth, whatever kind of object or something like that. So that's my view on it. And even going to the Bible, like Solomon, I think in Solomon it says there's nothing new under the sun.
Sure, yeah.
So, I mean, you can argue for that or against it. It's like, well, we have AI. AI is new. But what is AI? And like,
sure.
it's based on other things that came before it, kind of a thing. So,
like you said in the beginning, it comes down to definitions, how we define.
Yeah.
What do we define by, like, when we say new or create? Or
Yeah, I mean, like, if you were to just take, like, say, for example, somebody that, it's unfair because it's not a possible example, but if you had somebody that had no exposure to anything and put them on a stranded, an abandoned island, and he knows he's thirsty, and then, there's rain coming down, and he creates something to capture the water, not because he's seen anybody do it before, but because he's thirsty. But the point is that we would never know. That's too sterile, I think, of an example, that we wouldn't be able to get a response, from whether or not they would be. But the question is, would that be considered an original idea, in the sense that he's never seen anybody on a stranded island before, but he's invented some way to capture water? I don't know.
I don't know.
So I think, Roman, you're right. It does come down to definitions, because in that sense, according to the definition that I gave, that person would have an original idea. But when you expand outside of that person, that's really not an original idea, because like, you could cup your hands. Okay, I need something that will hold water. Okay, let me figure out, maybe put some leaves together or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's like, assuming we get kind of similar definitions of all these terms. I think it comes down to, like, we have all the resources. God has given us everything, right? We cannot come up with anything new. So what we can do is discover the existing things, the existing processes. Like in your example, you have the guy on the island who hasn't seen much in his life, and there are plenty of people in life who haven't been exposed to many things or many areas of knowledge. So it comes down for people like that to discover things, to learn things that already are in existence. And then the second aspect is creativity, because some people can be exposed to only like 2 or 3 concepts, but they know how to mix them up so well that they come up with this new creative product. And then you have another person who is extremely, knowledgeable of multitude of concepts, but they're not creative. They don't know how to mix them up. So they're good at discovering. This person is good at creating or being creative. and then I guess you have really talented people who are good at both.
Yeah.
Good question. I've never been asked that question before. It's very interesting.
So kind of.
It's a very original question, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
He's warming up to this microphone thing.
Yeah, it's good. So kind of going on a little tangent, but related a little bit. So we talked about definitions and how important it is to understand what the definition is of the words. How much do you guys find, you're both married, in your life where you and your wife are not on the same page, even though both of you use the same words?
I love my wife, and we never argue. So if she's ever watching, I'm just kidding. No, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because you find, I think the male and female relationship, particularly in marriage, is a unique one, and I think that that's why I guess that book was written. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Because there is some disparity, and I think that even like in we've talked about Nate Bargatze before, and he brings out some really interesting points when you have conversations in marriage, in particular. And I'm trying to think of the one story that he was telling, the other day. But he mentioned that he was meeting his wife. He was in a different town, and she was leaving for the airport, and he's talking to her, and he says, "Well, what time does your flight take off?" And he said, "It's 11 a.m." And she said, 12 o'clock. And he said, I'm not even sure you know how an airport works, because even if the plane was in the driveway, you wouldn't make the flight. And her response was, "No, that's what time I'm leaving is 12 o'clock." And he said, "Well, what did you think I was asking you? What that bit that he does." And the point being is that, I guess to your question, how often do you find in marriage that there can be this kind of disparity of definition? I think I don't remember if your question was how often, or if it was what do you do when you were posed with those type of situations.
Right. It's more. Have you found yourself kind of not being on the same page with your wife, even though you use the same terminology?
And I think that would happen in just about any relationship. And I also find that with the advent of cell phones and text messages, so much can be lost just in text messaging. So I think it happens in any relationship. I think in marriage, probably the frequency increases because that's the person that you communicate with most out of anybody in your entire life. So I think that increases. The frequency increases. But definitions are, I thought you were going a different direction with your question about communication, because I've actually had I wouldn't call it an argument, but a discussion with an atheist who said that because communication is imperfect, we cannot really ever get to a point where we fully understand what we're saying to one another. Mm-hmm. That's a whole different other rabbit hole.
I think that's part of the postmodernism.
Yeah,
where
that's right.
You cannot basically. Definitions are relative to each person or whatever it is. So there's no absolute. So therefore, anything can mean anything.
That's right. Yeah. But to answer your question, I just think in marriage, because of the frequency of communication, you're going to find, an increase. I think but you get to a point, I think, in your marriage also where you can understand the other person pretty well, so you can kind of anticipate some of those things.
Yeah.
But that's my response.
Two things come to mind for me. First is one of the theologians that I've read and listened to. I think at least he came up with the quote. Maybe somebody else did, but that's where I heard it. He says, before you say "I disagree," make sure you're able to say "I understand," right? Which is extremely powerful, and I try to apply it to my life. Not working so well, but I try. But very often we think we understand what the person is saying, and we jump on this, not bandwagon, but I guess we jump into this attitude or this posture of disagreeing without really understanding what the person is saying. And I think that's a source of a lot of many fights in marriages, but not only marriages, any type of relationship where communication takes place. People really need to clarify. Well, one party needs to make sure they speak precisely and clearly so that their message is delivered as clearly as possible. But the other party needs to make sure that they take time to understand and ask questions that will clarify what the other person is saying. So, yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's part of the noise in communication, like in any type of communication where you have sender and a receiver, any type of relationship, there's a lot of noise involved, right? And I don't know, I might be part of that group of people who will say that perfect communication is not possible. Just like absolute knowledge is not possible. Like we're not all knowing like God is. We can't have all the data available to us in the world so that we can, claim that we know. We say we know when we kind of feel like we have enough information, right? So it's this justified true belief. They call this in epistemology that you have enough information where you can claim that you know something, but we can really sit down and dissect that statement and say like, well, you don't really know because you don't know the way God knows it. You don't have absolute knowledge.
So can you know anything?
Depends on your definition of know. Right? Can you, like, God has ultimate absolute knowledge, correct?
Correct, without a doubt. Yeah.
Can we know that way as
No.
humans? No, we can't. Yet we claim that we know things.
Not ultimately, but I think not exhaustively. I think we can know things, not in the sense that it's exhaustive. But you and I obviously are communicating right now.
Mm-hmm.
You understand the words that I'm saying,
Mm-hmm.
so we can know what we're saying to one another.
So epistemology, study of knowledge, right? Where philosophers...
Is this what you wanted for this podcast, by the way? Is this
Yeah.
good? Okay.
Yeah, we're
where philosophers try to figure out what it means to know, right? As far as I know, most, like all classical schools of epistemology and most of modern, there are some schools that attempt to do something new, brand new and radical, but throughout the history, and most philosophers today will say that knowledge is true, justifiable belief. So first of all, it's a belief. You to say that you know something, you have to believe it, right? And that's what you're saying. Like, you're trusting me, so you're trusting your senses that I'm not. You're not in the matrix. You're like, this is the real world, right? Like, this is not a hallucination. But can you prove it? That's a different story, right? So
That
first
gets
of all,
back to what Descartes, right?
yeah. So first of all, it's a belief. Second of all, it has to be true belief. But for you to know if it's true or not, like, you can claim it's true, you have to offer some evidence, right? But still, like, even if you have those three, like, let's say cup is on the table, I believe cup is on the table, regardless if it is, maybe my eyes are lying to me, right? But I believe cup is on the table, so I have a belief. True belief, it has to, what I believe and what the reality is have to correspond, right? So for the cup has to be on the table for my belief to be true, right? But there has to be a proof that this is true, right? So I have to come up with evidence. Like, how do I know the cup is on the table? Well, because my eyes are telling me. My eyes have been historically healthy. Like, I've never hallucinated before. I've never had trouble discerning whether I'm in a dream or am awake, right? So I have evidence for justifying this belief and claiming that it's true. So this is kind of like basic. Of course, it gets much more complicated when we talk about more sophisticated things.
But does communication have to be perfect in order for us to even have this conversation right now?
No, so it's that's how I started, right? So it's similar. It's similar to knowledge. Like, knowledge is not perfect. Like, you don't have to know every single rock in the universe and every single planet for you to be qualified to know something, right?
And my only point was, so does communication have to be perfect in order for us to have a meaningful discussion?
What does it mean to
Of course, we
communication to be perfect?
And again, we could break everything down, to the core level of definitions, but that's not how communication happens.
Yeah,
Two
but I
people
want to know
talking
what
don't-
you mean by perfect communication.
So if we're talking about, and again, the example that I gave you was that somebody, an atheist in particular, said, well, we can't even talk about God. We can't even have this conversation because communication is not perfect, right?
Oh, okay, that's different. Yeah, that's not what I was.
So that's what I was after, and if we're going in your definition, perfect being ultimate knowledge, then no, we don't have ultimate perfect knowledge of every single word that's coming out of our mouth. But that's not what we need in order to have communication.
Yeah.
That's not a requirement. That's not how people communicate every single day.
Yeah. So the way I understood when you mentioned your conversation with the atheist is that our communication is not perfect in the sense that it's flawed, like it has shortcomings and it's not absolute, like the way maybe God would communicate with people. Like
Sure.
he will absolutely enlighten, and you will have this.
I see.
Right, like
Yeah.
our communication is flawed, and even if you do your best effort to communicate something to another party, to a receiver, there is still a good chance that it might be completely misunderstood. I had this model, like there was
Bring the microphone close.
there was this class on public speaking that I developed and taught a while ago, and I had this model, and I came up with this clever idea of a picture of one head and another head on the other end, and they're facing each other, and that's in a communication model, that's a sender and a receiver, right? And both of them have this cloud above their head, an idea, and one has a real apple that you can bite into, like a real apple that you can eat, right? And he's trying to communicate this concept to the receiver, and the receiver has a bubble above his head, and he has Apple logo, like iPhone logo, Apple, right? So both are talking about the apple, but obviously the information didn't transfer correctly. The communication was broken. There was plenty of noise where this person meant real apple, the other person understood. Like, it's a silly example, but it illustrates that sometimes both parties will walk away thinking that, like, okay, this happened. Like, I wanted to communicate. The other person's like, I clearly understood the other person. They walked away, but like, we are outsiders observing this, and we're like, this was a mess. Like, this didn't work, right?
And you say you don't have ideas. See that?
I didn't say I don't have ideas.
You did out there. Didn't you say that, Jerry? Didn't you say you didn't come up with ideas?
That's an example of broken communication. That's something else.
So I actually had a follow-up question for you guys related to communication and related to communication within or between a husband and a wife. When communication breaks down, what are some causes of that communication breakdown? Like what are the reasons why it breaks down?
Particularly in a marriage, or
Yeah.
okay.
Let's just kind of stick to that. Like, why would one person not hear the other person, even though audibly, like, they hear, but they're not perceiving or
I
that kind
can
of
maybe
thing?
give one example. I think what happens often in my marriage, in my relationship, is that a lot of times that I'll just assume, because I've been with my wife for so long and we know each other so well, that I could sort of shorthand communication to her and just assume that she knows what I'm saying. And often she'll say, well, hold on a second, like, you're not giving me the full story. And I have to take a step back and kind of go into deeper detail. And she's 100% right. I absolutely will rush that, sort of information, in the sense that I'm making the assumption that she knows what I'm talking about, because it's in my brain. She's part of me, that she knows what I'm talking about. And that's not, not fair to her, and certainly not fair to our relationship. And I kind of have to take a step back and apologize and say, you're right, I didn't explain that well. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily answering your question, but I think that, that's sort of where a lot of times, a breakdown will occur. That's one example of how that happens for us.
Yeah. What are some other, like, examples of why communication doesn't flow as well as it should?
It all comes down to noise in communication, just like you have radio waves, from one radio sender to the radio receiver going across a distance. There's a lot of noise. Distance can be a noise, right? Sometimes in the relationship, it can be as simple as you're downstairs, she's upstairs, and you're communicating, and the message is just being distorted by distance. That's noise. That's physical noise, right? Or kids are yelling over you, so the message changes. The context changes the message. The mood can change the message. Maybe you're in a great mood and you're communicating something, but your wife, she's having a bad day. Something happened to her, and she's not receiving the message the way you send it. She's receiving it in a completely distorted, different way. A person can be sick. You can use slang, language that's out of context, words that can be used on the TV in a TV show, but not in an intimate relationship. So all of these things, and there's probably infinite amount of variables you can list that would be qualified as noise. Physiological, psychological noise, linguistic noise, physical noise. All of that noise is what causes for communication to be broken down or distorted.
So like another two things that I was thinking about were stress, like when people are under stress or under pressure, let's say. Like if a wife or a husband is focused on something in the moment, and then the other person comes and tries to talk to them, it may not be the right time to have a conversation, depending on what that conversation is. So like having one person being under stress may enable or basically create an environment where that person reacts in a way that they wouldn't want to react, just because they're under that additional pressure. And then the other one I was thinking of is more like on the ego side, where if we subconsciously just want to win the argument or the conversation and are just defensive on whatever it is, I think that creates like a rift or a like you can't communicate if you're constantly either defensive or you want to be right all the time. Then I mean, I've seen it where it's just like you're trying to tell somebody something, or they're trying to tell you, but you're not hearing it because you have your own viewpoint on it, and you just want to hear it. Not that you don't want to hear it consciously, but subconsciously. Like I don't know if you guys can maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the root cause of, like, when you say what's the reason for communication breakdown. I mean, ultimately, it's the sin. It's the finitude of humanity. Like, we are broken people, right? So sin is at the root of it, and that's why, as Christians, we go to the Bible, and the Bible says that, when Apostle Paul writes this, he says, "Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church," right? And he gives this advice not to wives, not to women. He gives it to men, because like he gives advice to women, that's different. He gives advice to children, and that's different. But to men, he gives this specific advice because love your wives like Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? Well, he gave his life. He sacrificed. He was altruistic. He was selfless. He didn't live for himself. He lived for his church, for his people. And the Bible tells us that's how you need to love your wife, because Paul almost implying, like, because you have problem with this, because you tend to live for yourself and care about yourself, so you need to switch it around, flip it over, and do the way Christ loved his church. Now you need to love your wife that same way. And I think that's at the root of it. Like, we have to, as men, we have to learn to be selfless and live for our families, for our wives, love them that way, and that impacts how we communicate. Definitely.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in addition, I just want to add, to that particular verse, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. He didn't give us that command because it was easy for us to do. He certainly gave us that command because for men it can be difficult, to do that at times. And like you mentioned, there's a different command for women that, might also be, difficult for women. So that command is explicit in the sense that I think that, or I should say exclusive, to men, in the sense that that it's certainly more difficult for men to do that. But to your point though about winning an argument, I think that the pride and the infinitude, like that's where the if we get back to original sin, that's sort of baked into us, and having that pride and wanting to win an argument. I think that happens a lot, maybe sometimes earlier on in young marriages, but over time I think when you start to mature in marriage, you realize that it's not about winning the argument. And in particular for men, like if you're at a point where you're in the argument, you've already lost the argument because you're in the argument, right? So I think that I kind of liken a lot of these conversations though to evangelism, and I see often when I have witnessed other Christians talking to folks, maybe somebody of a different faith or different worldview, they're looking to win the argument as opposed to understanding and listening to what's going on inside of the heart of that particular person in that moment. And that is where I think we fall short on evangelism. I didn't mean to bring it in that direction, but that's just sort of where, if we're just talking to somebody because we want to be right, we want to, nobody likes to be wrong. Is there anybody on this earth that likes to say, I enjoy being wrong? There's nobody that likes to be wrong. And in particular, when it comes to your worldview, something that you've dedicated your life to and said, I'm willing to die for this. You talk to a Muslim, I'm willing to die for this. And now tell him that he's wrong. That's a tough conversation to have. I was listening to, and I'll end here, but I was listening to today a Muslim who converted to Christianity, and they asked him, what did it take, for you to convert to Christianity? It was a 12-year process. It wasn't a overnight thing. It was a 12-year process, and it was ultimately the love of the Christians that was given to him time and time again. It was the love that was poured into him that he said, I came into church, and it was right after September 11th, and the pastor the next day after September 11th happened, he came and he talked about how we're called to love our enemies. And at that moment I knew I was a Christian. So that love, and not, bring it back now to the marriage, right? To show that love for our wives and know that if we're in the argument already, we've already lost. And sort of, have some humility there. There's going to be disagreements that happens, but to do it in a way that, there's love involved and care, and not just trying to win the argument, which I think in young marriages that does happen.
I think there is a difference between being in an argument and trying to win an argument, because argument is actually can be and should be there, and
it's a taboo word. The word argument is sort of
or
can be taboo.
Conflict would be another way of saying it. But there is a destructive, right? Destructive conflict, and there is a constructive conflict. So constructive conflict is actually lack of conflict is just as big of a problem as a destructive conflict. So there's got to be conflict, because conflict brings people together, clarifies things, right? Creates better bonds. So conflict's got to be there, but it has to be a healthy type of conflict. And that's where this comes in, where one party tries to win in a conflict. It's a problem, right?
For the sake of winning. If you're trying to win for the sake of winning.
For the sake of
Agreed,
winning.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes strategically, like even if you can win and should win, maybe it's not the right timing.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
But conflict in itself is actually, like, a lot of people make mistake by avoiding conflicts, and that's just as bad.
Just as bad. Sometimes, yeah.
If not worse. I remember I had a family communication class actually at a Christian university that I went to, and the professor told us this story of this young girl in her class who said that I don't understand. My parents never argued, never fought. I thought, my friends were telling me that their parents would yell and scream and fight and whatnot. And I always thought, well, I have a perfect family. My parents never fight, never argue. It's always quiet and calm, until the day when they just divorced at one point, went their separate way. And she said, I never saw it coming. Well, they never discussed their differences. They never faced, the problems that they had. They just swept it under the rug, pretended like everything is fine. until it blew up out of proportion. So there has to be conflict. For any relationship will have messiness. Any healthy relationship will have conflict. Otherwise, people are pretending and faking it.
That's good.
Yeah. When it comes to communication, there's three components to the message or to the communication, right? There's the logos, the pathos, and the ethos.
According to Aristotle.
Yes. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, on those three?
Saying that there are three components to communication. I mean, it could be somebody's interpretation. I mean,
Sure.
There are different theories of viewing it, but this is just one of them, and it's an ancient one. So Aristotle had this theory of rhetoric, it's called, theory of rhetoric, how to persuade people. And he said that when you try to persuade people, especially in public speaking, there are three main components that you can break that communication down into. And that's logos, pathos, and ethos. Ethos comes from the word ethics and talks about the character of the person. So who is speaking? It's the first component. Second component is, they're not numbered that way necessarily, but the second component or another component is logos, which comes from the word logic, which talks about the content of what you're communicating. And the third one is pathos, and we see words like empathy, pathology, like it has to do with emotions. So it talks about how we communicate. So three things that we pay attention to, and I've trained myself when I listen to preachers or speakers or anybody. I pay attention to three things: who is speaking, like how do I assess this person? Like, is he an authoritative person? Is he an expert? Is he young? Is he old? Does he have experience or she? Like I look who the person is, character of that person, and so on, and that speaks volumes, right? Like. Famous example would be if you take a message, never give up on your dreams. That's the message, right? And let's say Michael Jordan is saying that, he says, never give up on your dreams. Well, that's an inspiring message. Now take that exactly the same message and put it in the mouth of Hitler. And he's saying, never give up on your dreams. Does that message change? It's a completely different message, right?
Yeah.
So that's the ethos of the part of the message, like who you are. So if an old, experienced, wrinkly, and gray-haired person says some, deep, profound quote, and you look at that person and you say, man, that's experience speaking, and you hear the depth of that quote, of that wisdom, right? Like, oh, wow, I receive it. And then you have some 14-year-old teenager say the same quote, right? And you listen, it's like, you need to grow up, that's a very shallow message. Like it impacts what the person is saying. So their age, their experience, their expertise, like if a PhD doctor is saying something versus, my friend who read something on Google, like, they might be saying exactly the same thing, but it will be received differently. So that's the ethos. Second one is logos, like the message itself. How well researched is the message, how put together, what kind of vocabulary it uses, like is it good, well-defined words, well put together sentences, is it logical, does it follow the laws of logic, does it have any logical fallacies in it, is it interesting, is it like using different literary tools or devices to persuade, so that's the logos, that's the content, and sometimes content is missing. Sometimes you're like so in awe of the person, like, wow, this person is so wise, and they're speaking absolute nonsense, like they don't have the logos, they don't have the content, but you're like, yeah, man, that's deep, that's good, but there is no message. Right, but that's logos. And sometimes you have a person, like I've seen preachers like that, like a person would come out to preach and they have solid content, but they're so boring and I don't know who they are, and even though they prepared a really, really good content, it's just, it doesn't make it to its destination. Like it falls on dead ears because I'm falling asleep. So that's logos. That's the second part of the message of communication. And the third one is pathos, which has to do mostly with emotions or how you deliver the message. I'll give you example. My wife likes to walk around the house with the phone in her pocket, and some preacher is preaching on the phone. She puts it on the speakerphone, maximum volume, and she walks around and listening to this charismatic preacher. And all I hear, like, I don't hear the actual words. I don't hear what he's saying. Like, she can hear it because it's next to her. I'm sitting in the office. She's in the kitchen. And all I hear is just the intonation and the pitch, and the person goes, "Whoa, whoa," and I feel my emotions being stirred, like, whew. Like, I just want to shout amen. I have no idea who that person is, what they're saying. I mean, I trust it's a good message because my wife is listening, and I know she won't listen to some heresy, right? But I don't know what the person is speaking, but am I being stirred? Yeah, I'm being stirred. Like, my emotions are being touched because of the way of how he is communicating, right? He knows how to use his speech, his intonation, different volume, right? Different pauses, how to influence the emotions of the people. And unfortunately, well, in my opinion, that unfortunately today a lot of motivational speakers, a lot of teachers, a lot of preachers are really good and really skilled at this pathos aspect of the message. They really know how to stir emotions, and I often catch people when nonsense is being spoken or empty words are being spoken by people, but because it's being presented and packaged so well, people just respond like, "Oh man, that's so profound." But if you like press that person to say like, "Well, what did you actually hear? What was the message?" I don't know, but like, it was powerful. Like you can find plenty of examples like that, and that's becoming really commonplace in our society, in our culture these days.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that was Aristotle's, I guess, sort of.
Yeah. So the source for that is I have a book, textbook on communication theories, and that's one of the theories, rhetoric by Aristotle. So that's how I know. Unless the book is wrong.
No, I got you. I was saying if you had communication with Aristotle directly, but
that's a different religion.
Are you or is Aristotle suggesting that this? And there's a follow-up question to this, but is he suggesting that there's something that we're doing subconsciously to determine whether or not we're going to be persuaded or not because of these three categories?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So without you just gave us this information that Aristotle had this theory that there's three ways that we determine whether or not we're going to be persuaded by this person. Fair?
I think he is talking to people who are trying to persuade. And
fair enough.
I like my assumption from what I've known is that he was observing these people, politicians who were trying to persuade masses or groups of people into a certain position, and he observed them and he came up with the theory that this is how persuasion works.
I see. But he came up with that theory because he knew that if he could nail down all three of these aspects, then he can win them over. Is that?
Yeah, you become highly successful at rhetoric and at persuasion.
I see. Is there a greater weight to any one of those three categories?
I mean, this is not a biblical approach, right?
Yeah, no, I got you. I understand.
This is outside of Bible, so I mean, it's very, very helpful to think about it this way. And there have been many more theories that modern linguists and motivational speakers have come up with, but this is just one of the ways. But this is so basic that it helps to analyze. I would say that ethos, the character of the person, plays the biggest role in my opinion, and that's the toughest one to get because it takes basically your lifetime to develop a good reputation and character and who you are and gain expertise and authority and experience and whatnot, right? So that's the hardest one to acquire, and that's the most impactful one in my opinion.
So I would say that it depends on the audience, like who the audience is. Let's say it's somebody who's younger that doesn't really pay attention to who's speaking. And then in addition to that, let's say they're more kind of emotionally driven rather than logically driven. So then the pathos, how the message is delivered, is going to resonate with them more whether that message is true or not, and whether whoever it is that's speaking. Or if you have another person in the audience who is more logical and not very emotionally influenced, or doesn't like to be influenced emotionally, then they will then look at who is speaking and what is the message, rather than how is the message being delivered, I think. So I think it depends on the audience. I agree with you, Roman, that if we were to just kind of analyze and say, out of the three, which one is the most important, I mean, to me, it would be the person who's speaking, but it would also be the message itself, not necessarily how it's delivered.
Yeah, I think ultimately those three are not separable. It's just where do you put more weight, right?
Yeah.
Like you asked.
And the reason why I asked it is so my career started out in sales, and in sales, there's all the different trainers that have different, I guess, sort of, theories on how to sell somebody else better. But there's a sales trainer actually out of Charlotte. His name is Jeffrey Gitomer. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but
No.
one thing that he said that I've always remembered is, all things being equal, people will buy from their friends. All things being not so equal, people still buy from their friends. Point being that if you can get somebody to like you, if you can be their friend, they might throw logic out the window. They might throw, is this a rational decision? That might, head towards the back of the decision-making process or the persuasion process. But I would agree that would, I think, fall, more on the ethos side. Do I like this person? Would I consider this person my friend? And if the answer is yes, there's a much higher probability that they're going to be persuaded and make a buying decision at that point. So it's interesting to see some of these things sort of, intertwine and work their way together.
Aristotle was a smart guy. Yeah. But another thing to consider in this is when we communicate, especially in public speaking, and I think this comes from public speaking, what is the goal in our communication? We really don't think about it, but there's always a goal. Like, what are we trying to do? And there are like three main goals that speakers try to achieve. And that would be either to inform, right? So you're not arguing for anything, you're just informing a person or informing the audience. Second goal would be you're trying to persuade. Right? And the third one would be entertain, or I would say more broadly, to stir people up, either anger, like emotionally anger, or laughter, or love, or compassion, things like that, right? So those three things, those three goals are quite different. Sometimes it's a combination of some of the goals, but I think depending on what you're trying to achieve in your communication, that's where you start adding more weight to either ethos, logos, or pathos. Right, so if you're trying to stir people emotionally, like for example last Sunday at our church, the sermon was quite stirring, right? Like I didn't really had a chance to analyze like what was the content of the message. Like it was good enough, but like I was more taken away with the pathos of it. Like it was quite emotional, and I felt my emotions stirred up, and if that was the goal of the message, then mission accomplished. It was good. And, entertainers like comedians, they will come out and they will try to get people emotionally laughing or being entertained. That's a different way to stir people.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you for joining me. This was the first of many, I hope. It was fun for me, at least. I don't know, Roman, you tell me. You have a different expression about it.
Next time I'm here, I need some kind of a heater. My hands and
sorry.
I'm cold. I'm shaking.
Yes,
it's gonna get a heater. Keep them warm up.
It's gonna get warmer outside too, but yes, I'll get a heater. Yeah, David, thanks for joining as well.
Thanks for doing this, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, we should definitely do it on a regular basis.
Awesome. You're a great host.
Thanks. Yeah. All right. Until next time. Signing off.